The bag tore open first, and then Harold Stokes hit the concrete. His shoulder went down before his knee did, his cane skidded off the curb, and the small orange bottles from the drugstore rolled in 3 different directions, like something spilled from a torn pocket in a movie. He tried to say something. What came out was closer to a breath than a word. And around him, on that busy stretch of sidewalk in downtown Columbus, a dozen people stopped moving and did absolutely nothing. Before we go any further, take a second and tell me in the comments what part of the world you're listening from, and hit that subscribe button so you don't miss stories like this one. Harold was 73 years old that morning, and he had walked the same 3 blocks from the drugstore on Fifth Avenue to his little brick apartment building on Chestnut Street for close to 40 years. He knew the crossing guards by first name. He knew that the bodega on the corner had trouble with the freezer door in the winter. He knew that the sidewalk in front of the old dry cleaner buckled a little in the summer, and he stepped over that spot without even thinking about it. The neighborhood was the map of his life, and the map had been safe for as long as he could remember. So when the young man in the gray hoodie stepped out of the doorway of the closed shoe store and reached for the paper bag under his arm, Harold's first thought was not fear. His first thought was that the young man had lost his balance. His first thought was to help. He said the word "hey" the way a grandfather says it when he thinks a stranger has bumped into him by accident. He said it soft. He said it once, and then the young man yanked hard on the bag, and Harold's arm flew up with it, and his hip turned the wrong way, and the sidewalk came up faster than the sky went down. The pain arrived a second after the fall. It was a hot white line from his hip to his knee, and for a moment he could not breathe against it. His glasses had jumped off his face, and without them the world softened into a smear of coats and shoes and the pale winter sky. He heard the paper bag rip, and he heard the little plastic bottles skitter across the concrete, and he heard, very clearly, someone laugh. Not loud, just a short bark of a laugh from somewhere behind him, the way people laugh when they are nervous and do not know what else to do. Tyler Brandt was already 3 steps down the sidewalk with Harold's wallet in his fist by then. He was 22, thin, with the kind of long face that looked younger than it was, and he had not planned any of this when he left his mother's apartment that morning. He had walked to Fifth Avenue with a folded piece of paper in his pocket and a name written on it, a name that meant nothing to him and everything to the woman who had cried when she put the paper in his hand. He had not intended to hurt anyone. He had intended to find a pawn shop, and then a payday lender, and then a job, in that order, and he had failed at all 3 before 10 in the morning. When he stepped out of the doorway of the closed shoe store, he was not thinking. He was drowning, and he saw an old man with a paper bag, and something in him grabbed at the surface without asking his permission first. He did not look back at Harold on the sidewalk. He could not have said later why he did not look back. Later, in a small grey room with a metal table and a woman in a dark suit across from him, he would say that he thought if he did not see the old man, then nothing had happened yet. Later still, in a courtroom, he would say something different. But in that first moment, all he did was tighten his hand around the wallet and walk faster, and the crowd on Fifth Avenue opened around him and closed behind him and let him go. Harold pushed his good hand against the concrete and tried to sit up. He could not. Something in his hip had let go, and every time he moved, the hot white line ran up his side and stole his breath. He turned his head slowly, because turning it fast was not possible, and he looked for his cane. It had come to rest against the curb, and he could just make out the little brass tip that his wife Miriam had polished for him the year before she died. That brass tip was the first thing he thought about clearly, not the pain, not the wallet, the little brass tip on the end of the cane. Miriam had said, "Don't ever lose this cane, Hal. I paid too much for it." Miriam had been dead for 6 years. He had been walking to and from that drugstore alone for 6 years, and the reason he had been at the drugstore that morning was because his heart medication had run out the night before, and his cardiologist had told him, in the softest possible voice, that if he ran out again, he was to call the office right away and not wait until morning. He had waited until morning. He had told himself that skipping one dose would not hurt anything. He had told himself the same thing about a lot of small choices for a lot of years. The little orange bottles were still rolling. One had stopped against a mailbox. One had slid under a parked car. And the one that mattered most, the one with the white cap and the long word he could never pronounce, had come to rest 3 feet from his face. The label turned toward him as if to remind him that it was there, and he was here, and there was now a distance between them. The people on the sidewalk stood in a loose ring around him and did not move. A woman in a camel coat looked at him and then down at her phone. A man in a delivery uniform slowed, glanced at Harold's shoes, and kept walking. A teenager with a backpack lifted a phone and started recording. A middle-aged man near the bus stop stared at the sky the way people stare at the sky when they are pretending not to see something on the ground. And Harold, on the concrete, understood something he had never really understood before, even in 73 years of being alive. He understood that being seen is not the same thing as being helped. Across the street, at the bus stop by the shuttered movie theater, Patricia Cole had been watching for 4 minutes. She was 38 years old that morning, a high school counselor at a public school 2 miles away, and she had missed her first bus because her coffee maker had broken, and she had missed her second bus because she had stopped to look for her wallet in a coat pocket she had already checked twice. She was going to be late. She was already writing the apology email to the principal in her head. And when the young man in the grey hoodie stepped out of the doorway across the street, she had noticed him the way anyone notices anyone. She had thought briefly that he did not belong in that doorway. She had thought briefly that she should keep an eye on him. She had thought a lot of small, careful things, and then she had done nothing with any of them. When Tyler grabbed the bag and Harold went down, she felt her whole body go cold, in a way she had felt exactly one time before in her life. She was 17 years old the first time. She had been standing at a different bus stop, in a different city, and she had watched a man step off a curb into the path of a car, and she had not called out, and the man had lived, but not the way he had lived before. She had told herself for 21 years that she had not called out because she had not had time. That was the lie. She had had time. She had not called out because she had frozen, and she had never quite forgiven the 17-year-old girl who had stood at that curb and done nothing. Now she was 38, and she was standing at another bus stop, and an old man was on the ground across the street, and she could feel the same cold in her hands. She told herself she was waiting to see if someone else would go. That was the lie she was telling herself in real time. She could feel the shape of it as she was telling it. Someone else would go. There were a dozen people over there. Someone else. The woman in the camel coat, the delivery man, the teenager. Someone. No one moved. Harold tried again to push himself up. His good arm shook, his shoulder gave out, his head dropped back to the concrete with a small sound she could not have heard from across the street, but that she felt in her teeth. And then she saw the teenager with the phone take a step closer, angling the lens down at Harold's face. And she saw Harold turn his head away from the lens, and she saw the way he closed his eyes, and the 17-year-old girl at the other curb, in the other city, 21 years ago, took a breath, and Patricia Cole ran. She did not remember crossing the street. She remembered the middle of the street, and she remembered a car horn, and she remembered thinking that she was going to fall and hit her chin on the asphalt because she had never in her life been able to run in her work shoes. She did not fall. She reached the sidewalk, she went to her knees beside Harold, and she put her hand on his hand. "Sir," she said, "Sir, can you hear me? I'm here. I'm right here." Harold opened his eyes. He looked at her, and his face was grey with pain, and he tried to speak, and only a small breath came out. She could smell the sharp, clean smell of the pill bottle by his cheek. She could see the way his shoulder was sitting wrong. She could see, without needing anyone to tell her, that this was serious. She took her phone out of her pocket and she called 911. And while the line was ringing, she put her free hand under his head and she took off her coat and she folded it and slid it under him. She kept her voice calm because she had learned, in 15 years of talking to teenagers in crisis, that if her voice was calm, the person on the other end of her voice would find a way to be calmer. She told the dispatcher where they were. She told the dispatcher what she saw. She told Harold that help was coming. Then she looked up. The ring of people had not moved. The teenager was still filming. The woman in the camel coat was still on her phone, though now she was looking down at Harold and not at the screen, and there was something small and stricken in her face that had not been there before. "Put the phone down," Patricia said. Her voice was not loud. It carried anyway. "Come help." The teenager did not put the phone down at first. He stood with it in his hand and stared at her, and she stared back, and she did not look away. There is a thing that happens in a moment like that, and Patricia had seen it in her office 100 times when a teenager was trying to decide whether to keep lying or start telling the truth. The thing happened on the sidewalk. The teenager lowered the phone. He said very quietly, "What do you need?" "His head off the concrete," Patricia said. "Kneel down, keep him talking." The teenager knelt. His name was Marcus, and he was 16 years old, and he would go home that night and cry into a towel so his mother would not hear him, and he would delete the video without watching it. But on that sidewalk, at that moment, he knelt down and he put his hand on Harold's shoulder, and he said, "Sir, my name is Marcus, and my grandma has the same cane you got." Harold made a sound that might have been a laugh, it might have been pain, it might have been both. The woman in the camel coat took a step forward. Her name was Diane, and she had a daughter Harold's granddaughter's age, and she had already been on hold with an insurance company for 22 minutes when Harold fell, and the shame of what she had done and not done was going to keep her awake for a long time to come. She knelt on Harold's other side. She said, "I have a scarf. Can I put it under his shoulder?" "Yes," Patricia said. "Slow." More people came. Not all of them, not most of them, but more. And by the time the ambulance turned the corner onto Fifth Avenue with its lights spinning silently against the storefront glass, there were 6 people around Harold Stokes, and one of them was pressing a scarf into the crook of his shoulder, and one of them was holding his good hand, and one of them was picking up the little orange bottles and putting them carefully back into the torn paper bag. And Patricia Cole was still on her knees beside his head, and she had not let go. The ambulance took Harold to Grant Medical Center. Patricia rode with him because he asked her to, and she did not know how to say no to a request that quiet. At the hospital, the emergency doctor told her that Harold had fractured his hip. He would need surgery. He would need weeks of recovery. He would need physical therapy. He would need, and here the doctor lowered his voice slightly, someone. Patricia did not correct the doctor. She just nodded. She sat in the waiting room while they took Harold up to the surgical floor, and she called her school and told them she would not be in today, and she called her sister and left a voicemail that made no sense, and she opened a browser on her phone and looked, without meaning to, at the video. The video was already up. Someone had uploaded it in the time it had taken the ambulance to arrive. It was 37 seconds long. It began with Harold on the sidewalk, and it ended with Patricia running across the street. The person who had shot it had not, in the end, been Marcus. Marcus had been filming, but Marcus had deleted his file. The person who had uploaded the video was a man Patricia had not even seen at the time, a man who had been standing behind a parked truck, and he had captioned it with 3 words that Patricia would remember for a long time. The 3 words were, "Look at them." The video had 100,000 views by dinner. It had 1 million by the next morning. It had 4 million by the second night, and by then it had a name. People were calling it Fifth and Chestnut. People were calling the ring of bystanders a lot of other things, and people were calling Patricia by a name she had not asked for and did not want, and the name was the Woman Who Ran. Harold came out of surgery late that night. He slept until the middle of the next afternoon. When he woke, the first person he saw was a nurse. The second person he saw, standing in the doorway of his room with a paper cup of coffee she had not drunk any of, was Patricia. He did not say the obvious thing. He did not thank her right away. He looked at her for a long moment, and then he said, "You didn't have to come back." She said, "I know." He said, "But you did." She said, "Yes." There was a chair by the window. She sat down in it. She did not know what else to say. He did not seem to need her to say anything. They sat like that for a while, in the quiet way people who have already been through something together can sit in a room without needing to fill it with words. After a while he said, "There was a picture in my wallet." She turned her head. "Yes, my wife," he said. 1968, on a bench in the park. She had a scarf that day, red one. There's writing on the back of the picture. Her handwriting. Patricia did not say anything. "I've carried it for 55 years, he said. "That's the only thing I want back. The money doesn't matter, the wallet doesn't matter, the picture." Patricia said, "I'll try." She meant that she would call the police. She meant she would ask. She did not mean anything more than that, because there was no more than that to mean. But she said it, and Harold closed his eyes and turned his face a little toward the window, and the sun on the linoleum floor cut across the room in a long, clean line, and Patricia Cole understood that she had already begun to promise things she did not know how to keep. Tyler Brandt was arrested at 4 in the afternoon on the second day, in the parking lot of a fast food restaurant on the north side of the city, sitting in the passenger seat of a car that was not his, holding a phone that was not his either, and crying so hard he could not answer the officer's first 2 questions. He had by then seen the video. He had seen his own back walking away from Harold on the sidewalk. He had, in a way, seen himself for the first time. The officer who found him did not know until later that the wallet Tyler had used had held $11 in cash, 1 credit card that had been cancelled that same morning by an automated fraud system, an old library card from a branch that had closed in 2004, and folded very carefully into a small square inside the billfold, a black and white photograph of a young woman on a bench with a scarf around her neck, laughing at something outside the frame. The officer took the wallet into evidence. She did not open the little square. She would not, in the ordinary way of these things, have had any reason to. 2 things happened on the third day that changed the shape of everything. The first was that Patricia Cole went to the police station and asked quietly and stubbornly if the wallet had been recovered. It had. She asked if she could see it. She could not yet. But the desk sergeant, who had seen the video, and who had a father Harold's age, told her that as far as he could see from the property log, the wallet had been recovered intact. Cash, cards, and 1 photograph. The second was that Patricia went back to the hospital, and when she stepped into Harold's room, there was a woman standing at the foot of his bed with her arms crossed over her chest and a suitcase on the floor by her feet. The woman had Harold's eyes exactly. She had his mouth. She was maybe 45, and she was wearing a heavy coat she had not taken off, and she turned her head when Patricia knocked on the door frame. And she said, "You're her." Patricia said, "I don't." "You're the one from the video." Patricia said, "I'm Patricia Cole. I'm sorry, are you?" "Rebecca," the woman said. "Rebecca Stokes. I'm his daughter." Harold, in the bed, did not look at either of them. He was looking at the ceiling. Rebecca had not spoken to her father in 6 years. She had not spoken to him since the week her mother had died. Patricia would learn this later in pieces. That week, 6 years ago, Rebecca had flown in from Denver for the funeral, and something had been said, or not said, that neither of them could quite name afterward. And Rebecca had gone back to Denver and had not returned any of the 4 phone calls her father made in the following month, and by the time the 5th phone call would have gone through, they had both stopped counting. It had not been a fight. It had been quieter than a fight, and worse. It had been the thing that happens when 2 people love each other and are also, in ways they cannot explain, afraid of each other, and neither of them is willing to be the one who speaks first. The video had reached Denver on the 2nd morning. Rebecca had been in the parking lot of a grocery store when a co-worker sent it to her, and she had sat in her car for 90 minutes before she had been able to drive home, and she had booked the flight from her kitchen at midnight, and she had not told her father she was coming. "I didn't know if you'd want me here," she said, still not looking at Patricia, still standing at the foot of the bed. "I didn't know if he would." Harold said, without looking away from the ceiling, "I want you here." Rebecca's shoulders dropped a full inch. It was a small movement. It was the kind of movement Patricia had seen 1,000 times in a counseling office when a teenager who had been braced for the worst finally exhaled. Patricia said very softly, "I'll come back tomorrow." Harold turned his head then. He said, "No, stay. Please." She stayed. Rebecca sat down in the chair by the window. Patricia stood by the door. Harold looked from one to the other of them, and then he said the thing that would set the rest of it in motion, though none of them knew it yet. He said, "The picture. Did they find the picture?" Patricia said, "They found the wallet. Everything was in it." Harold closed his eyes. Rebecca said, "What picture?" Harold said, "Your mother, the park bench, 1968. Rebecca said, "Oh." There was something in the way she said, "Oh," that made Patricia look at her more carefully. Rebecca was not looking at her father. She was looking at her hands. There was, on her face, the very particular expression of a person who has just remembered something she has been trying not to remember for a very long time. "Dad," Rebecca said, I need to tell you something." Harold did not open his eyes. "Not now, sweetheart. There's something about that picture." He opened his eyes then. Rebecca said, "I know what she wrote on the back." Harold said, "You've never seen the back of it." "I have," Rebecca said. "Once, when I was 12. You left your wallet on the kitchen table and I opened it. I was a nosy kid. I opened it and I saw the picture and I turned it over and I read what she wrote and I put it back and I never told anyone. There was a silence that was not a silence, because in the hospital there is always a beeping somewhere and a wheel rolling somewhere and a voice on an intercom saying a name. But inside the room, between the 3 of them, the silence was total. Harold said, "What did it say?" Rebecca looked at her hands again. Then she looked up at her father, and her eyes were wet, and she said the sentence she had been carrying by herself since she was 12 years old. She said, "It said, if anything ever happens to me, tell her the letter is in the attic." Harold did not move. He did not speak. The line on the monitor by the bed climbed by 3 digits and then came back down. Patricia stood very still by the door. Rebecca said, "I didn't know what letter. I didn't know who her was. I was 12. I put it back. And then Mom got sick. And then Mom got worse. And I forgot. Dad, I forgot." Harold said in a voice that was barely a voice at all, "You didn't forget." "I did. You put it away." She nodded. He closed his eyes again. When he opened them, they were wet too. He said, "It's all right, sweetheart. It's all right. You were a child." Patricia, standing by the door with her hand on the frame, understood that she had walked into something she did not belong in. She said, very quietly, "I'll come back tomorrow." And this time, Harold did not stop her, because Harold was already reaching for his daughter's hand, and Rebecca was already crossing the room to take it. Patricia went home that night and did not sleep. She sat in her kitchen with the light off and the window open a crack, and she listened to the traffic on her street. She thought about the 12-year-old girl who had turned over a photograph and read a sentence she had not understood and had put it back and had spent 33 years not saying it out loud. She thought about the 17-year-old girl she herself had been, at another curb, in another city. She thought about how many things a person can carry inside themselves quietly for decades because they do not know what to do with them, and how sometimes the thing that finally cracks that quiet open is not therapy or time or grace, but a stranger falling on a sidewalk on Fifth Avenue. She got up. She made coffee. She sat by the window until the sun came up. And then she went back to the hospital. Harold was sitting up. Rebecca had gone to the cafeteria for tea. The room smelled like the small, tired flowers someone had left in a plastic cup on the sill. He looked at her when she came in and he said, "There's a letter in my apartment." She said, "Yes." He said, "I need to go get it." She said, "You can't get up yet." He said, "Then I need you to." She said, "Mr. Stokes." He said, "Harold." She said, "Harold, I can't just—" "I've been carrying a picture in my pocket for 55 years, he said. "I've been walking past that attic every day for 6. I never opened her boxes after she died. I couldn't. I don't know what she wrote. I don't know why she wrote it. And I'm 73 years old with a broken hip in a bed I might not walk out of. And if I don't know what's in that letter before I die, I will spend the rest of eternity being angry at myself. And I have too many things to be angry at myself for already. Please." Patricia sat down on the chair by the window. She did not answer right away. She looked at Harold. She looked at the plastic cup of flowers. She looked at the little brass tip of the cane which someone had leaned against the wall by the door. She said, "Which box?" He told her. He told her the name of the building and the number of the apartment and the location of the key that he kept in a small brown flower pot on the second-floor landing, and the name of the neighbor who would let her in if the flower pot key was gone. He told her that the attic was really only a crawl space above the closet in the bedroom, and that Miriam's boxes were in the far right corner, and that there were 7 of them, and that they were labeled in her handwriting, and that the one he had never been able to open was the one labeled Hal. "Not Harold," he said. "Hal. That's what she called me." Patricia said, "I'll go this afternoon." He said, "Thank you." She said, "You keep saying thank you." He said, "I keep meaning it." She went that afternoon. The neighbor, a small round woman named Doris, with a small round dog named Biscuit, let her in with a face full of curiosity. She was too polite to speak out loud. The apartment was tidy in the way of a man who lived alone and had been taught by his wife how to be tidy. There was a coffee cup washed and turned upside down on a dish towel by the sink. There was a copy of the newspaper folded on the kitchen table with the crossword filled in halfway in pencil. There was a single reading chair by the window with a lamp beside it and a footrest in front of it and a soft brown blanket folded over the arm. Patricia stood in the middle of the living room and felt her throat close for a moment. She had been a stranger to this man for 48 hours. She had known him for the length of an ambulance ride and 2 hospital visits. And here she was in his home, about to open a box his wife had told him about through a photograph he had carried in a wallet for 55 years. She went into the bedroom. She found the closet. She found the small square door in the ceiling of the closet. She found a step stool in the hall. She climbed up. She turned on the small pull-chain light. And in the far right corner, exactly where he had said they would be, were 7 cardboard boxes. And the one on top said, in a woman's steady, careful hand, "Hal." She brought it down. She sat on the edge of the bed with it on her lap. She could feel her own heartbeat in her ears. She did not open it there. She carried it back to the hospital. She sat in the chair by the window with the box on her lap, and Rebecca sat on the edge of the bed with her father's hand in hers, and Harold said, "Open it." Patricia opened it. Inside the box there were letters. There were letters in envelopes tied together with a piece of blue ribbon. There were postcards from places Miriam had visited alone in the summers between college years. There was a small notebook with a green cloth cover, and on top of everything, in an envelope that had been sealed and never opened, addressed in Miriam's handwriting not to Harold and not to Rebecca, but to a name none of them had ever heard, was a letter. The name on the envelope was Eleanor. Rebecca said, "Who is Eleanor?" Harold said, "I don't know." Patricia held the envelope up so he could see it. He looked at it for a long time. Then he said, "Open it." Patricia said, "It's addressed to somebody else." Harold said, "I'm asking you to open it." She opened it. The letter was 2 pages long. It was written in Miriam's careful cursive, on paper that had yellowed only slightly. It was dated the summer of 1967, 1 year before the photograph on the park bench, 6 years before Rebecca was born. It began with the words, "My darling girl," and it ended with the words, "I hope you have your father's kindness and none of my fear." And in between those 2 lines was the story of a young woman who had, at 19, given a baby up for adoption, and who had spent the rest of her life hoping that baby would one day find her way home. Harold read it 3 times. His hand shook. Rebecca read it once, and then she got up and walked to the window and stood there with her back to the room, and her shoulders did the small movement that shoulders do when a person is trying not to cry out loud in a place where other people can hear. Patricia said very softly, "I didn't know." Harold said, "Neither did I." Rebecca said, without turning around, "I have a sister." Harold said, "You have a sister." The room was quiet for a long time. Outside the window, a helicopter went by, low and loud, and no one flinched. Harold said, finally, "The picture on the bench. She wrote something on the back that day. She let me read it. She said, 'Someday I'll tell you the whole thing.' And then she got sick and she got well and she got sick and she got well. And finally she got sick and she didn't get well. And she never told me. She left it in a box. She left it for me to find on my own. I didn't." Rebecca turned around. Her eyes were red. She said, "Dad, she left it for you to find with someone. She left it for you to not be alone when you found it." Harold said, "How do you know that?" Rebecca said, "Because that's who she was." Harold looked at Patricia. He said, "That's why she said her. That's why the picture said, 'Tell her the letter is in the attic.' She meant Eleanor. She thought Eleanor would come looking for her one day. She thought Eleanor would find me first and I would give her the letter." Patricia said, "Harold, it's been 55 years. She might not." He said, "I need to try." Rebecca sat back down on the bed. She said, "We need to try." That was the beginning of the second story, which was not the story anyone had come to the hospital to tell. The first story had been an old man on the sidewalk and a young woman who had run to help him. The second story was a letter in an attic and a daughter no one had known existed, and the 2 stories from that afternoon forward were braided together, and none of the 3 people in the hospital room could quite say afterward where one ended and the other began. Rebecca stayed in Columbus. She rented an apartment 3 blocks from her father's building, month to month. She called her office in Denver and asked for a leave of absence, and her office, after a conversation that took 2 days, gave it to her. She began to spend her mornings at the hospital and her afternoons at her father's apartment, sorting boxes she had never known were there, and she began to ask questions she had been afraid to ask for 30 years. Patricia went back to work. She testified in a preliminary hearing about what she had seen on the sidewalk. She sat in a small room with a lawyer from the district attorney's office and told her story in a voice that did not shake, though her hands did. She met briefly in a hallway of the courthouse a small woman with a tired face and a coat that was too thin for the weather, and the small woman said, "You're the one from the video." And Patricia said, "Yes." And the small woman said, "I'm Tyler's mother," and she began to cry. The mother's name was Angela Brandt. She was 44 years old. She worked 2 jobs, one at a nursing home and one at a laundromat, and she had raised Tyler and his younger brother alone since Tyler was 4. Tyler's father had left, and then Tyler's father had died, and Angela had done the best she knew how, and Tyler had, until 18 months ago, been a boy who had never in his life been in trouble for anything worse than skipping a math class. Angela had, in the last 18 months, been given a diagnosis. She had not told Tyler what it was at first. She had told him only that she needed a certain surgery, and that the surgery was expensive, and that the insurance would not cover it, and that they were going to have to find a way. She had said all this, the way a mother says something to a son when she is trying to protect him from the size of the thing. She had not known that Tyler had gone into her drawer and read the letter from the hospital. She had not known that Tyler had walked out of the apartment that morning with the name of the surgeon in his pocket. She had not known, until Tyler was arrested and she was called to the station, that he had been trying to find money, any money, in the wrong way, for a reason he had never told her. Patricia listened to Angela in the courthouse hallway. She did not know what to say. She said, in the end, "I'm sorry." And Angela said, "So am I." And they stood there, 2 women who had come from opposite sides of a sidewalk on Fifth Avenue, and they did not know each other at all, and they knew each other completely. That night, Patricia sat with Harold and Rebecca in the hospital room, and she told them what Angela had said. She was not sure she should. She was not sure it was her place. But she said it because it was the truth, and because the truth had been the thing that had begun to matter to her in a way it had not before. Harold listened without moving. When she was done, he said, "How old is she?" Patricia said, "Angela." He said, "The mother." Patricia said, 44. Harold said, "How old is the boy?" Patricia said, 22. Harold said, "So she had him at 22. Rebecca said, "Dad." Harold said, "I'm not saying anything, sweetheart. I'm just doing math." Rebecca looked at Patricia. Patricia looked back. There was, in Harold's voice, something that had not been there before. It was not forgiveness. It was too early for forgiveness. It was more like the first crack of something that had been frozen for a long time. 2 days later, Harold was moved from the surgical floor to the rehabilitation wing. He would be there for 3 weeks. He hated it. He was 73 years old, and he had been walking 3 blocks to a drugstore under his own power for 40 years, and now he could not stand up from a chair without a nurse's arm under his elbow, and every time he stood up, the pain in his hip reminded him that the young man in the grey hoodie had done more than take his wallet. Rebecca stayed with him every afternoon. She read to him. She brought him newspapers. She brought him crossword books because she remembered from when she was a child that he had always liked crosswords, and he did the crosswords in a shaky pencil, and he complained about the clues, and she pretended to argue with him. And something between them that had been frozen for 6 years began to thaw, one afternoon at a time. Patricia came in the evenings. She had begun, without meaning to think of the evenings at Harold's bedside as the shape of her week. She would leave the school at 4. She would take the number 9 bus. She would stop at a small deli on the corner for a sandwich she would only half eat, and she would sit in the chair by the window and read the pages Harold and Rebecca had sorted from the boxes that day. The letters in the boxes were mostly from Miriam's mother. They were letters written across 40 years. They told the story of a family that had been quietly generous and quietly stubborn and quietly haunted by the same secret Miriam had carried into her marriage and had never quite been able to tell her husband. The secret had a name. The name was Eleanor Marsh, and she had been born on a hot September afternoon in 1962 in a small hospital outside of Chicago, and she had been given up for adoption at 7 days old, and her mother had, before she signed the last paper, written the baby's name in her own hand across the top of the file, and the file had been closed, and the file had been sealed, and Miriam had never seen her again. Rebecca hired someone to look. It took the person she hired 6 days to find Eleanor Marsh. Eleanor was 61 years old. She lived in a small town in Wisconsin. She was a nurse. She had 2 grown children and 1 grandchild. She had known for most of her life that she was adopted. She had, 20 years ago, tried to find her birth mother, and she had failed, and she had put the question away, and she had lived with the not knowing, the way most people learn to live with the not knowing of the important things. On the 7th day, Rebecca called her. Rebecca did not remember afterward what she had said in the first minute of the call. She remembered only that Eleanor had been quiet for a long time. She remembered that Eleanor had asked one question. The question was, did she ever talk about me? Rebecca said, she wrote you a letter. Eleanor said, she what? Rebecca said, she wrote you a letter. It's dated the summer of 1967. It's 2 pages long. It's in my father's apartment in Ohio, and my father would like very much to give it to you. Eleanor said, your father. Rebecca said, my father is not your father. He didn't know about you. He found out 4 days ago. He's in a hospital right now, and he says the letter is yours and he would like to put it in your hand himself. Eleanor did not answer for a long time. Then Eleanor said, I can drive to Ohio on Saturday. The Saturday she drove was the day of the 3rd week Harold was in the rehabilitation wing. She arrived at the hospital at 3 in the afternoon. She was tall and thin, and her hair was grey in the way Miriam's hair had gone grey, and when she walked into Harold's room and Harold saw her, he covered his face with his good hand and cried without sound for a full minute, because she had her mother's eyes, and because he had been married to her mother for 39 years, and because he had thought, on the sidewalk on 5th Avenue 3 weeks ago, that the last chapter of his story was already written. Rebecca stood by the window with her hand over her mouth. Patricia stood in the doorway because she had walked in behind Eleanor, and now she could not decide whether to stay or go. Harold, after a long time, took his hand away from his face. He held out the envelope. He said, your mother wrote this for you in 1967. I only found it a few weeks ago. I want you to read it in your own time. There's no hurry. Eleanor took the envelope. She held it against her chest. She said, thank you. And then she said, can I sit down? Harold said, please. She sat in the chair by the window. Rebecca went and sat beside her, and after a moment Rebecca put her hand on Eleanor's arm, and Eleanor did not move away. The 4 of them were quiet for a long time. There was a helicopter again, somewhere outside. There was a food cart in the hallway. There was, on the small television mounted on the wall, a game show with the sound off. And in the room, on the edge of Harold's bed, sat a woman who had not known who her mother was until 7 days ago. And a woman who had not known she had a sister until 3 weeks ago. And a man who had not known any of it until a young stranger had knocked him to the ground on a sidewalk on 5th Avenue. Patricia said from the doorway, I'll come back tomorrow. Harold said, you'll stay for dinner. She stayed. Tyler Brandt's trial began on a Thursday in the 2nd week of the 3rd month. The prosecution's case was, in the ordinary way, straightforward. The video was played. Patricia testified. A police officer testified. A doctor testified about Harold's hip. Harold, who could now walk with a cane again, and who was seated in the 2nd row with Rebecca on one side of him and Eleanor on the other, watched the proceedings with a face that gave nothing away. The defense was going to be short. Tyler's lawyer was a public defender named Vanessa Alvarez, who was 29 years old and who had, in 3 years on the job, learned that most of the work of her job was not winning trials, but softening what came next. She had prepared Tyler carefully. She had told him that he would be asked to speak, and she had told him what to say, and she had told him what not to say. Tyler had listened. Tyler had nodded. Tyler had told her the night before that he would try. He did not do what she told him. When the prosecution rested and the judge asked the defense to present its case, Vanessa Alvarez stood up and she said the sentence she had prepared, which was, "Your Honor, my client would like to make a statement." The judge nodded. Tyler stood up. He was thin in his suit. He was, in that moment, 22 years old, and he looked younger. He turned toward the second row. He did not turn toward the judge. He did not turn toward the jury. He turned toward the row where an old man was sitting between two women, and he looked at the old man, and he said the sentence he had not prepared. He said, "Mr. Stokes, I'm sorry." The courtroom was silent. He said, "I'm not going to say I don't know why I did it, because that's not true. I know why. I did it because my mother is sick and I was scared. I know that's not a reason, sir. I know that's not an excuse. I've been sitting in a cell for 3 months, and I've thought about that morning every day, and I know what I did. I put my hands on a man who was walking home from a drugstore. I put my hands on my own grandmother's neighbor. I put my hands on a man who never did anything to me, and I ran. And when I ran, I didn't look back. And what I've thought about most, sir, is not what the judge is going to give me, and it's not what my mother is going to have to go through without me. What I've thought about most is that if that woman across the street had not run over to help you, I would have left you there. Somebody who wasn't me would have had to save you. And I don't know how to be the person who lets that be true, sir. I don't know how. I don't know how to be that person. I'm asking you. I'm not asking for anything. I'm asking you to know that I know. I'm asking you to know that I heard you say, "Hey." I heard you. I heard you and I ran. I heard you and I ran, and I'm going to hear you say, "Hey," for the rest of my life. He sat down. He was crying. Vanessa Alvarez put her hand on his arm. She did not look at the judge. In the second row, Harold Stokes did not move for a long time. Rebecca had her hand on his knee, Eleanor had her hand on his other knee, and Patricia Cole, who had been sitting in the third row, leaned forward slightly, because she had lived long enough as a school counselor to know a real apology when she heard one, and she had never heard one quite like this. The judge cleared his throat. He said, "Mr. Brandt, please sit down. Thank you." Tyler was already sitting down. He nodded anyway. The judge sentenced him 3 weeks later. He gave him 3 years. Tyler's lawyer had prepared him for 5. Tyler took the 3 years without moving. In the front row, his mother Angela cried into a paper napkin. Behind her, Harold Stokes stood up slowly with his cane, and he made his way to the aisle, and he walked past his own daughters, and he walked past Patricia, and he stopped at the row where Angela Brandt sat, and he sat down beside her, and he took her hand in his. He did not say anything to her. He just sat there. He was 73 years old, and he had a fractured hip that had healed wrong, and he was going to walk with a cane for the rest of his life. And he sat beside the mother of the boy who had knocked him down on the sidewalk, and he held her hand while she cried. Rebecca, from where she was standing in the aisle, put her hand over her mouth. Eleanor put her arm around Rebecca's shoulders. Patricia looked at the two of them, and then she looked at Harold and Angela in the front row, and she understood, in a way she had never quite understood before, that the world is not divided into people who help and people who do not, but into people who are honest about the moments when they froze and people who are not. The video had, by then, been watched by more than 20 million people. Fifth Avenue had become, in the 11 weeks between the fall and the sentencing, a different sort of place. The corner where Harold had gone down had a small metal plaque now, put up by a neighborhood association that had not existed 6 months earlier. The plaque did not say Harold's name. It said, in 3 lines of small clear letters, "In this place, we do not walk past. In this place, we cross the street. In this place, we help." Patricia had not helped write the plaque. She had been asked. She had said no. She had said, without knowing why she was saying it, that she did not want her name on a plaque, because a plaque was for a story that was finished, and she was not sure this story was finished. She had instead agreed to something else. The neighborhood association had asked her, and Diane in the camel coat, and Marcus with the phone, and a few of the others to be the first members of something the neighborhood was calling a community watch. It was not a formal thing. It did not carry a badge or a jacket. It was, mostly, a list of phone numbers of people who lived and worked on Fifth Avenue between 3rd Street and Chestnut, who had agreed that they would look up from their phones when someone was on the sidewalk who should not be, and who had agreed that they would cross the street when someone was on the sidewalk who could not. The Community Watch Board, when it was finally dedicated, went up 2 blocks from where Harold had fallen. It was a small wooden board painted white with a corkboard center for names and numbers and notices. The names on the board at the dedication included Patricia Cole, Diane Ramirez, Marcus Wheeler, Doris Kaplan, and, at Harold's insistence, Angela Brandt. Angela had not wanted her name on the board. She had said no twice. Harold had asked a 3rd time. She had said yes. She had said, when she said yes, that she did not know if she deserved to have her name on a board on a street where her son had done what he had done. Harold had said, in the small crowd that gathered on the day of the dedication, in a voice that carried farther than he had meant it to, that the board was not for people who had never done anything wrong. The board was for people who had decided, from this point forward, not to walk past. Angela's name went on the board. 2 days after the dedication, Harold walked from his building on Chestnut Street to the drugstore on Fifth Avenue for the first time. He walked slowly. Rebecca walked on his left, Eleanor walked on his right, and Patricia, who had come by that morning to bring him a coffee, walked behind them, because there was not room for 4 people abreast on the sidewalk. Harold stopped at the corner where he had fallen. He did not stop for a long time. He stopped just long enough to look at the plaque and to touch it lightly with his fingertips and to say, in a voice only the 3 women behind him could hear, "Miriam, if you're listening, we found her." Then he kept walking. He bought his heart medication that morning. He paid for it with a new wallet that Rebecca had given him. The new wallet had, folded very carefully into a small square inside the billfold, the black and white photograph of a young woman on a bench in a park in 1968, laughing at something outside the frame, with a red scarf around her neck, and on the back, in her own careful hand, the sentence Rebecca had read once when she was 12 years old. He walked home. He walked past the corner. He walked past the shuttered movie theater. He walked past the bus stop where Patricia had stood for 4 minutes on a morning that had changed all of their lives. He walked past the small metal plaque on the corner where he had fallen, and he did not stop this time because he had already stopped. At his building on Chestnut Street, Doris was on the stoop with Biscuit on her lap. She waved. He waved back. He climbed the 3 steps slowly. He went up to his apartment. Rebecca went up with him. Eleanor and Patricia stood on the sidewalk for a moment, in the cold air that was, by then, beginning to turn towards spring, and they looked at each other, and they did not say anything, because they did not need to. Eleanor said finally, "I'll come back next weekend." Patricia said, "I'll be here." Eleanor said, "I know." They both smiled. Eleanor got in her car. Patricia walked to the bus stop across the street at the corner where she had stood for 4 minutes on a morning that had changed her life, and she stood there, and she waited for the number 9 bus, and while she was waiting she watched the corner where an old man had fallen, and she watched people cross the street to look at the plaque, and she watched a young woman with a stroller stop and read the 3 small lines out loud to a baby who could not yet understand them. The number 9 bus came. Patricia got on. She sat by the window. She watched Fifth Avenue slide by. She watched the corner get smaller and smaller in the glass, and then it was gone. And then she was going home. She thought about the girl she had been at 17, at another curb, in another city, and how that girl had stood still. She thought about the woman she had been at 38, at the bus stop across the street from Harold Stokes, and how that woman had stood still for 4 minutes and then had not stood still any longer. She thought about how a life is mostly the sum of the moments a person does not act, and how, every so often, A single moment when a person does act can lean back against all of the other moments and change the weight of them. She thought about Harold's face when he had first opened his eyes on the sidewalk and seen her, and she thought about the sentence he had said in the courtroom to Angela Brandt, which had not been a sentence at all, only a hand. She got off at her stop. She walked home, she unlocked her door, she hung her coat, she sat down in her kitchen. And she picked up her phone, and she opened a browser, and she watched the video one more time. She had not watched it in months. She watched it all the way through. She watched the woman on the sidewalk look at her phone. She watched the man in the delivery uniform slow and keep walking. She watched the teenager with the backpack lift his phone. She watched the moment the woman across the street began to run. She turned the phone off. She got up. She went to the window. She looked out at the sidewalk in front of her building, which was empty at that hour, in that light. She looked at it for a long time. And then she went to the closet, and she put her coat back on, and she walked out the door, and she went back to Fifth Avenue. Harold was on his stoop when she got there. He had a coat on, and Rebecca was beside him with a coffee in each hand, and Eleanor was on her way from Wisconsin again, and the sun was going down over the shuttered movie theater across the street, and Doris was sweeping her front step, and Biscuit was sniffing at a paper bag that had blown against the curb. Harold saw Patricia coming. He raised his hand. She raised hers back. She crossed the street. She kept crossing the street. From that day forward, whenever she saw someone who needed her to, she crossed the street when a woman was crying on a bench. She crossed the street when a boy was standing too long at the edge of a curb. She crossed the street when an old man dropped his groceries in the rain. She crossed the street 100 small times, in 100 small ways, over the years that followed. And she never once told anyone about it because she had learned on Fifth Avenue that the good work is quiet, and it does not need a plaque, and it does not need a name. Harold walked his 3 blocks to the drugstore every week for another 11 years. He walked them slowly. He walked them with a cane. He walked them, in the last 2 years, with a small oxygen tank on a little wheeled cart that Rebecca had painted red so he would not lose it. He walked them alone sometimes, and with Rebecca sometimes, and with Eleanor sometimes when she came into town, and once in the 5th year with Angela Brandt, who had by then become someone who came to his apartment for dinner on Sunday nights, and who had in that 5th year been given a bill of clean health after a surgery that Rebecca and Eleanor had, without ever telling Harold, quietly helped to pay for. Tyler had by then come home. He had served his 3 years. He had come out of them into a job at a moving company, and then into a small apartment with his mother, and then eventually into a life. He had not asked to meet Harold. He had not felt he had the right. Harold had, in the 6th year, sent him a card on his birthday. The card had said in Harold's shaky, careful hand, "I have thought about you. I hope you are well. Come by if you like." Tyler had come by. He had stood on the stoop of the building on Chestnut Street, and he had not been able to knock. He had stood there for a long time. Doris had opened the door for him. She had said, without asking who he was, "He's expecting you." And Tyler had gone in, and he had sat in the reading chair by the window, and Harold had sat on the sofa across from him, and they had not said much. They had not needed to. Tyler had heard him say, "Hey," on the sidewalk on Fifth Avenue, and Harold had heard him say, "I'm sorry," in a courtroom, and neither of them was going to forget those 2 small sentences, and neither of them was going to need to repeat them. The plaque on the corner of 5th and Chestnut is still there. The community watch board is still there. The little brass tip on the end of the cane, which the paramedics had picked up from the curb that morning and put in the ambulance with Harold, is still there too, on a nail by the front door of the apartment on Chestnut Street. Rebecca hung it there after her father died, in the winter of the 12th year, quietly in his own bed, with his daughters on either side of him and a photograph in his hand. The photograph was of a young woman on a bench in a park in 1968, laughing at something outside the frame, with a red scarf around her neck. On the back, in her own careful hand, she had written the sentence Rebecca had read once when she was 12 years old. She had written, "If anything ever happens to me, tell her the letter is in the attic." And in the small kitchen in the apartment on Chestnut Street, on the wall above the table where the crossword still lay half-finished in pencil, Rebecca and Eleanor hung the letter, framed, so that anyone who came to dinner would see it, and they hung beside it a smaller frame, in which they had placed the sentence Patricia Cole had said on the sidewalk on Fifth Avenue, on the morning that had changed all of their lives. The sentence was 5 words long. It was written in Rebecca's own hand, in black ink, on a piece of white paper. The sentence said, "Put the phone down, come help. If this story moved you, if it made you think about the moment you froze or the moment you didn't, do me a favor and leave a comment below and let me know, and hit that like button and subscribe to the channel, because there are more stories like this one coming and I want you to hear them."